What's going on, everyone? Grace and peace. Welcome back to another episode of the Proverbial Life podcast. What you're getting ready to hear is an interview I did with Pastor Aldo Leon. I went down to Miami to visit him and his church family, and unfortunately was not able to record this episode with him in person as we had planned. But this was a week or so after coming back from Miami, and this is the conversation we had. I hope and pray that you're blessed and encouraged by it. For those of you who have wondered, why am I no longer pastoring and what's going on, some of this will give you some more information and some more detail. With this information, I pray that you're informed, and I also pray that you use this as an opportunity to search your own heart and ask the Lord to grow you in the work of reformation as we seek to make much of Christ. With no further ado, enjoy this episode. Till next time, grace and peace. Let's get it.
Kingdom polemics exists to equip the church for battle against the kingdom of darkness in light of the particular threats of our day. Kingdom polemics is about taking the cosmic Christological concepts of the Scottish Reformed and connecting it to the ground.
Welcome to Kingdom Polemics. We are having a conversation today that is a bit different. Been a lot of little different things here and there that I've been doing lately. The Tertullian thing was a bit different. So we're going to talk about someone's experience, which I think is more than just his experience. But I want to put this on the record because I hear this story, I hear this testimony all the time. The things that Edwin, I'll introduce in a second, has gone through, is going through, is a regular and ongoing and somewhat increasing reality. There are many men who are either in ministry or pursuing ministry that are rediscovering a lot of our Protestant past. And as they do so, it comes with a difficulty, it comes with some controversy, it comes with some cost. And so there are many men and women, that are married to us, that are going through the costliness of reform and reforming. And I could obviously share my own story about it, and maybe some of that will come out here. But yeah, I want Edwin to discuss how his journey to reformation has led to the things that it's led to for him and how he's processed it. So I know you have to introduce yourself a bit differently, because like you're now in a point of transition, but go ahead and let folks know who you are. You're the Israel conversation guest. That was a while ago. So let us know who you are and where you're at now, just in some paraphrastic uh, statements.
Yeah. So, Aldo, thank you for having me. My name is Edwin Ramirez, former pastor of a small church in Western New York. We had about between 190 people, given whether or not there was a potluck that Sunday. But yeah, man, I've been in ministry for over a decade, uh, different capacities. I have a small YouTube channel, The Proverbial Life, wife, 4 kids. And yeah, man, I'm looking forward to talking about my experience, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm in the early process of it, given that 2 weeks ago is when I had my last day at the church. And since then, just been processing, thinking, evaluating myself, and just assuring or tightening up some areas in my own thinking to help me clearly understand what took place, especially moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of times when you're in the middle of these things, it's hard to like understand what is going on and what happened at times. And then retrospectively, there's a little bit of a HD clarification
Yep.
in a lot of things. So why don't we start with describing your personal journey of reforming? So let's think about you reforming personally and start with like what led to what And as you talk about your personal journey of reforming and this leading to this, where were some places you struggled, um, and you went through as you embraced one thing that led to another thing? So let's start with that.
Yeah, man. So uh, I think I was predestined to be a Presbyterian. Uh, just the Lord, man. I wasn't raised in a Christian home, weren't taught biblical truths other than just the Lord's Prayer, praying as quickly as you can so that you can eat your food. That was the kind of home I came from, Catholic background with grandma and everything like that. And then kind of grew up, um, you know, there was an acknowledgement of God, but it wasn't the Lord Jesus Christ. Lord saved me at a Pentecostal church, and I think the beginning work of being presented uh, or introduced to Calvinistic thinking was probably in my early stages of when I came across this guy named John MacArthur. At that time, I was a McCarthyite. And then when I'd grown in the Lord had helped me understand some problematic and some differing issues that I have with his understanding on some things. And then I was introduced to men like Thomas Watson and the Puritans. Then it became like kind of your Calvinistic evangelical people like Paul Washer and Vodi Bakum, and little by little, man, just growing and reading and thinking and asking questions. And so throughout those years, became a pastor at different points, or at least leading some kind of capacity in ministry. And most recently being called to be the pastor at this church in 2000. And I think during that time,
Wait,
I
in 2000?
so in 2000, excuse me, 2020, pardon,
Okay.
2020.
I was like, you've been pastoring for 25 years.
I know. Excuse me,
All
excuse me.
right.
Thank you. Um, the pandemic messed my mind up. I think 2000 is 2020.
Yeah, so about 5 years ago.
Yeah. So 2020, I was called to be the pastor at this church. I was a member at the church, and the pastor left out of nowhere. He just quit, and there was a vacuum. You know, there was no one to fill the pulpit. I was a member. Prior to him leaving, I was filling the pulpit occasionally on his behalf,
But
preaching the
yeah,
word.
you had pastoral experience before that as well.
Yes. Yeah. So filling the pulpit, preaching, he leaves. Now the elders at the time asked me, uh, can you fill the pulpit indefinitely? And the reason why they didn't take me on to be an elder was because in 2019, when the pastor was still there, I told him that I believe in infant baptism. So I think that's really 2018 going into 2019, I started looking into infant baptism again. My wife and I, before we had children, had done some Westminster Confession studies and all this, and still wasn't quite convinced. And then around 2018, 19, I opened up that conversation again of a Westminster Confession and thinking through these things. And again, at that time, I didn't understand covenant theology. It was still new to me, really fresh to me. But I was listening to some guys, Ligon Duncan did a series on infant baptism and covenant theology, and it just clicked for me, man, where I understood it better than I've ever understood it before prior to that point. And at that point, I communicated that to the pastor at the time, and because of that, that was the reason why I couldn't be an elder at that church when he was still the pastor there. So when he left in 2020, the elders didn't even have me as a consideration because, as far as they knew, I was Presbyterian with respect to baptism. So that's kind of how
Look,
that's.
this is a Reformed-ish Baptist church.
This is a Calvinistic church.
This is a Reformed-ish.
Right. So they'd be, neo-Calvinistic. They, hold to the sovereignty of God, soteriology, but nothing more. It was really just
Mhm.
McCarthyites. Really, it would be their description of what they believe.
Yeah, yeah. And so, become? How did you go from that to being a KJV preaching 1615 Psalter confessing, post millennial acapella exclusive psalmody?
Yeah.
Like, how'd you go? I mean, because you just said, oh, I was a Paedo Baptist.
Yeah.
Calvinist who got called to this church,
Yeah.
the 5 years ago. Now you're all these other things. So yeah, how'd that happen, man?
Yeah,
Like,
it happened in stages, bro. So like that. Thank you for asking that question, because the the other things like the KJV, that process I started thinking through in 2016. But again, I think this really lends to the problem was that I was never at a church that practiced these truths, and so when I came across them, they were truths that I was really looking into and convinced by, but didn't have a place to walk that out and think through it collectively with others. And so I connected with brothers like Robert Truelove and others to think about the Textus Receptus and the text of Scripture and its authenticity and comparing that to the critical text, et cetera. That whole conversation I had in 2016, but because I wasn't grounded at a place and because my main diet was individuals online that I was thinking through that topic with, uh, I never I never took it on wholesale. So I believed it at an arm's length, but never truly walked it out and lived out those convictions. But I think the past 3 years, 2 to 3 years, is when now in the position of a pastor, I became more convinced by these things that I'd looked into in the past. And now I had the resources and the tools uh, theologically to wade through them a little more, where now I owned them and now I can start helping others understand it and own it in a way that is more clear and has some substance to it. So, yeah, a lot of these things that you mentioned, I was introduced to in the past, but maybe out of fear of man, or maybe, maybe I'm crazy, right? There's no one else around me that thinks these things. And so I'm not going to, continue to walk this out outside of a community where no one else thinks like me on these topics.
yeah, yeah, and that's a huge factor in this conversation. Is a lot of what we process in these matters, particularly like these more traditional confessional, close to second reformation principles that have been lost. Like, these are things that we have to process very in isolation,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it's uh, I mean, I'm not saying that, like, PCA the PCA ordination process doesn't have us deal with reform views. They do. I'm not even saying that, seminaries like RTS and Greenville, whatever. I'm saying there's a lot of things still that are not normal conversations
Right.
in the mainstream of seminaries and even larger denominations. I never had to think through head coverings in my journey of ordination or education. I never had to think through psalmody. Now, maybe some institutions or places do help men think through psalmody, but for the most part, a lot of these things, because there isn't much of a predominance of them,
Mhm.
you are stumbling up on them by yourself. And a lot of times you stumble on them in the pasture where all of a sudden now you have to think through these things and you have time to think through these things, and you have a book budget. That's important for me to bring out because I think the discovery of these things as you're ministering can be taken the wrong way by those who see you ministering. They're like, where did this come from?
Right.
Why are you doing this? As if, like, you had this nefarious plot in your mind that I am going to take a job and then I'm going to go out of my way to find all these things that are shocking. You're just, you haven't been brought up in an environment where many of these things, like, even like the establishment principle, these are things that are not very commonly taught and enforced denominationally. And so you begin to think through things as a pastor, and then you begin to look into it, and then you realize, okay, this is something that I haven't been taught. And then you realize that it's not just some anomaly, strange thing. When you begin to talk about it out loud, and then you're thinking about this, and you're talking about this. And so the issue is, a lot of us men, we're discovering things in ministry that we should have learned under care. We're discovering things as we pastor that we should have learned, from our local churches as members, right? And the navigation of that difficulty is very important because it could make you believe that because I am finding these things at this point in my journey, there's something wrong in my journey. This is a lot of times what happens to us. Like, man, like, did I like take a detour somewhere wrong that got me to this point? And this is just what happens when the Matrix, you know,
Yeah.
red pill, blue pill, becomes a part of like the story of you know your church era. But was there anything out of these journeys into further reformation that got in the way of you getting there sooner, other than you did say that there was the issue of there wasn't like a broader environment conversing about these things, but were there other things that like got in the way of you getting here sooner or more with more fluidity?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it leads me to this point that I was going to make in light of what you said, is that when you're used to being in an environment of superficialness, and you're almost maybe not ridiculed, but looked at sideways by asking deeper questions and thinking through things, uh, then you're kind of like put on an island, and now you're either crazy or you conform and start speaking correctly again. And I've found myself in that area where I've come across, let's say, the topic of head covering. Well, you can't really have that conversation with too many people because there's a surface level that people are functioning in. And not just, I'm not even talking about lay people, even ministers. You start talking about things and it's just like, well, the gospel is what matters and winning souls and all this. It's like, yeah, I get that. But the Bible also talks about this too. And so what do we do with that? And so I think that was a big stumbling block, man. Again, I'm coming from the Baptistic non-denominational world where the main things are justification by faith alone and the five solas and all those things. And then when you get outside of that world, to ask more questions, now you're kind of on an island. And that's what I found, man.
Yeah.
uh, Being on that island now, it's like, you hear statements like, be careful, that's legalism. Or I know someone who used to believe that very thing and they went down this path. And now you're like, there's a distance that's being created between you and other people, and it happens real quick once you start talking about other things that maybe we don't all agree on.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a social stigma component that is much more powerful than we realize. It's hard to be in the Christian universe and to process things and to be deemed sub-Christian in a very quick and disproportionate, unfair way. And I think it reminds me somewhat like what goes on and by the way, your experience in the Reformed Baptist non-denominational world, what you describe, it's also very much a thing in the confessional world too. Now, I'm not going to say it's the same. I do think that we do have more convictions about more things, but that evangelical vibe that makes the sociological, like the redemptive, somewhat of like the ongoing mantra that either implicitly or explicitly demeans or diminishes other points of precision in doctrine. Like that is something. I was talking to a friend of mine uh, in Florida about a PCA church that he goes to, and he's like, I hear the gospel every Sunday, which I appreciate, but there are many things in the Word of God that I do not get taught on. And this is the issue with the redemptive historical, you preach Christ in every sermon, that for some reason then unpreaches much imperatible things. and says, yeah, that's in the Word of God, but like it's not as important as the gospel. Therefore, it's not important.
Right.
And so there's a shaming that goes on when you begin to think more precisely about more things. And this reminds me somewhat of like you're in like these secular schools and colleges. It's not places for people to think anymore.
Mhm.
It's places to be indoctrinated with the common consensus of what people think is important. This is the same thing in church. Instead of, now obviously I'm not trying to sound postmodern or something like that, but I think that there are conversations that are legitimately Christian conversations, right? So head coverings is not like a unchristian conversation. Translations of the Bible is not an unchristian conversation. What we do in worship and what songs we sing, it's not like, oh, let's talk about everything and let's debate everything. But what I've noticed is like legitimate Christian things are not welcome conversationally,
Right.
but it is like this dogmatic, uh, very closed and socially abusive culture that does not allow for deep thought to be expressed. So I don't even think the bigger problem is not even like that. The whole world is not like we are reform wise. That's not the problem. The problem, that is a problem, but I think these things are biblical things that we hold to. But I think the bigger problem is that we don't even have the moral fortitude to
Yep.
discuss them. Like a guy stops singing hymns in church and he's taken out back and beat up and kicked in the floor. I'm speaking
Sure.
metaphorically. You start talking about the singing of psalms and the potential for those man-made hymns and worship to be sinful, and we're not having a conversation. We're having a fist fight, and all of a sudden, your entire Christianity is being diminished in some way by the conversation itself.
Right.
So,
Which is ironic because we all love to hear the Great Commission, right? Go make disciples of all nations. But what is it? Teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded. Well, what is all things that he's commanded? I mean, pick up and read. So we are to be talking about these topics that nobody wants to talk about. I say nobody, but that are taboo to talk about and think through and discuss and wrestle through. And it's like
mhm,
we have this like almost just we're not quite like, and I say we kind of evangelicalism, it's not quite like just squeeze my hand and repeat after me and pray this prayer, but it's a sentiment of it. It's like, just believe these things and you're good, and you can always be at a superficial level on these other things, because if you go too deep, it'll lead to legalism. It leads you to dark places, because I know people who went down that road, and you want to go down that road. And what that did for me throughout the years is, I'm not the type of person, when someone says, uh, don't look into this, I'm not the type of person to say, "Oh, I need to get away from this." When you say don't do this, I'm thinking, well, why are you telling me not to do this? Like,
mhm,
what's the hang up in you saying not to look at the
yep,
topic of head coverings, or what's the, I think of like, I know it's kind of off topic but similar, but think of like James White. Okay, James White detests the TR position, right? He's articulated that in many spheres, right? And he's an advocate for the critical text. Okay, but I've never looked into it, so I don't want to just believe James White because James White said it. And I
mhm,
think that's the work of personal reformation, is like thinking and asking questions and digging deeper and asking why. Like,
yeah,
well, like, okay, I hear James White and he's a doctor and he sounds smart, but like, he could be wrong.
yeah, yeah. That's the issue, is that there's an elitist culture in the Christian West where you know so and so says this, so and so seminary
Right.
teaches this,
Right.
and therefore that's what it is, and there's no need to talk about it, and to even okay, let's talk about it. Let's question James White. Let's question Joey Pipa and his position on an inclusive psalmody. You know, I'm not saying that everybody acts the same way, but I do think that there is somewhat of like, you know, this name dropping institution dropping that somewhat shuts the conversation down, at least implicitly so. And I'm like, well, guess what? The narrative is not controlled by what these men say about what they're saying about. Our conversation is much larger and longer. We have voices, authoritative voices that are heard in many writings over many centuries, over many confessional documents. And for example, the establishment principle. So the average seminary is not going to teach that. The average pastor in the PCA is not going to teach that. You know, there's not a strong verbal support for the establishment principle. And it's almost as if that those elites now are like these gatekeepers, where if we talk about the establishment principle, we're not going to actually have a conversation about that. People are going to start insulting you, questioning your convictions, questioning your integrity, even in questioning your view of the gospel. My view of the gospel has been questioned in the Reformed world more than once for my confession of the establishment principle. My profession of the gospel has been questioned because of my optimistic eschatology that is post-millennial. And so we don't have, in many ways, actual theology by theologians. What we have is elite gatekeepers. This like these aristocrats, right? That someone have they have like the game on lock,
Right.
so to speak. And there's a lot of regular people and regular pastors like, we don't care about your gatekeepers.
That's
We
right.
don't, respectfully,
Mhm.
because we understand that our faith is not limited to these particular modern day gatekeepers that wrote books and our presence of seminaries or flagship churches. We have a much broader testimony of the church. So,
Mhm.
yeah, it's a good thing. So we're going to move a bit and ask how did your family deal with these things, and how did you help your family deal with these things? So how was it like for your family, and how did you lead them to these? Because this is where I feel like this is an important thing to bring out, because Reformation not only is difficult in the ecclesial, but it's also difficult in the household. This is where actually I think many men struggle in the ecclesial realm because they struggle in the familial realm. So why don't you tell us about that part?
Yeah. So I'll use the topic of head covering as an example. That's the most recent thing that affects um, my wife and also me when I was the pastor at the church I was currently at. So I never taught on head covering publicly, not on my podcast nor at the church. And yet, head covering was a topic for many years. My wife and I had listened to, had been familiar with, but had chosen not to go down that route because I just don't got the bandwidth. And, my wife, I'm not wearing nothing on my head, but she would have friends who would talk to her about these things. So that was the seed moment, as it were.
Mhm.
Okay. Then circumstances had taken place in our lives where the topic had come up again. And so, okay, topic comes up. I'm thinking about it. I'm searching. I'm reading the scriptures. I'm listening to some sermons, and I'm reading. And then I present it to my wife. Okay, and this is how my wife processed it. First I knew like, okay, she has an introductory understanding of this topic, and it's something that I need to bring back up because it's serious. It's something that God is kind of putting His finger on, as it were, at this time of our life. And so I talk to her and we process it together. She asks tons of questions. I follow up with people, ask them questions, keep reading, keep asking, so on and so forth. So we come to the point, fast forward, where my wife is convinced, primarily First Corinthians 11, reading the text and, coming to that place where she sees it, and also giving her some tools to help her think through that. So she starts practicing head covering. Um, and now it becomes a problem, unbeknownst to me, because no one had spoken to me about it, but it became a problem because there's now a clear distinction between my wife, who's wearing a head covering, and everyone else's wife at the church who isn't wearing a head covering. And it became something that was heightened, and became almost a place of resentment toward us, that I come to later find out was the case, because we were just simply walking in obedience to what we believe God teaches in His Word.
Hmm.
And again, hadn't gone had I never charged anyone for being legalistic, or never charged anyone for not being a Christian if they didn't wear head covering. Never, and no one ever mentioned it to my wife either. We just quietly, humbly practicing in obedience what we believe the scriptures are teaching, because we're convinced by that. And it really, I think that was the catalyst that brought it over the edge at our church. And so when you ask, how did I bring my family through this? Conversation. My wife trusts me as a leader. She's seen my growth in the Lord throughout the years, and she knows that I'm not just trying to lead her into all sorts of things without looking into them myself. But then also, I'm not dictating to her what she better believe. It's like, baby, you need to search the scriptures. This is what I'm thinking through. This is what we're dealing with. These are some resources. Ask me some questions so I could process this with you, and then let's walk it out in that way, and we'll patiently walk through this together. So that's how that took place with my family, particularly as the topic of head coverings was the
Yeah.
issue then.
Is there anything that was hard for your wife as you transitioned as a leader that she was more resistant to
A leader in general, or a leader?
in your pastoring? Like pastoring in more reformed ways. I remember something if you forgot. Maybe you remember, but go ahead. Do you remember anything that she struggled with? I can remind you if you.
Yeah, remind me.
So I think I remember your wife struggling with experimental preaching, and that's a very reformed thing. It's like
Yeah.
you meddle in application
Yes.
and you go there, and that was something that she was struggling with, and you had to
Yeah.
help her understand what it was.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, she struggled with that, and that's the thing. Like, my wife is very submissive, but she asks really good questions. She's a great thinker. She thinks very thoroughly. So she'll see implications of things that I don't see at times, and she'll bring them out in questions. And so when I started preaching that way, it wasn't that she was fighting against me, but it was like, what's up with this? Like, why have you changed, or what is it that is causing you to change? And so as I walk her through why there have been changes, and then she sees the fruit of it, because she experienced the fruit herself, but then she's hearing it both negative and positive. And
Mhm.
then it's confirming the things that I talk to her about, and she recognizes, like, wow, this is actually an attack that's taking place in light of the word of God penetrating in a unique way that it hasn't in the past, because of this experiential preaching.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I would say that was, I'm glad you brought that out, because that was another tipping point. I think there were stages. So I think it started there. It started with the
Mhm.
preaching.
Yeah.
In fact, I remember, I tell the story. I've told you this, but I remember sending you a sermon and feeling kind of proud of myself. I think this is a good sermon. I'll send it to Aldo, and also asking one of the other elders at the church at the time, "What do you think of my preaching?" And you said, the sermon, besides making fun of my blazer that I had on, you said the sermon was good, but like it wasn't experiential preaching per se. And you kind of spoke into that, gave me a book recommendation. I bought the book, read the book, and then I listened to some of your preaching and other preachers who preached that way, and it clicked for me. So now, like anything, when you learn, you learn. This is at least how I learn. I learn by practice. And so
Mhm.
I'm fumbling and stumbling through this new thing that I know how to preach, right? I was taught how to preach and how to prepare sermons, homiletics and all that. But then there's this aspect, this kind of turning of the diamond, as it were, where you're like now applying the text in such a way that really steps on things that need to be stepped on,
Mhm.
that excavates things that need to be pulled out. And bro, when that happened, it was like, all right, I've got a problem with you that I didn't know I had with you. And now, and you keep doing it, right? Like, that was the other thing. I was getting emails at the time calls, text messages. What did you mean by this? Why did you say this? Why did you that? And patiently walking through that. And when that started to get highlighted by a group of people, at the church, it became more of a problem when I didn't stop doing that.
Mhm.
It was like, okay, maybe Edwin had an off Sunday. Maybe he,
Yeah.
had something, that bothered him really bad, but he keeps doing it. And I don't like this. That was another thing that got me in trouble, as it were.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've come to understand more recently is that I don't think that a lot of guys that are like in this world of reforming more, I don't think the biggest problem is that they hold to, the TR position or the acapella, establishment, whatever. No extra holy days, whatever.
Yep.
I think the biggest issue that Christians have is with experimental preaching that preaches to the conscience, to the feet, to the hands, and takes these concepts and exegetes the world that these people are in and makes actual connections and actual admonitions. That's why they don't like these men. And the extra practices that they don't like, it's just more things to use against
Yes.
the person, but it's not about those doctrines or practices per se, though it's related to it. But I do think it's like this kind of preaching, it makes me feel like I need to change,
Yeah. It exposes.
and I'm not okay by just coasting on my previous graces, and then other things become more used. But the bigger issue is like the preaching. That's
Yeah.
just
And to that point, bro, I would say, like, you know, the people who, in the beginning of my time at this church said that they loved me, and cared for me. I don't doubt that that was their sentiment toward me then, but I did see how their love for me, or at least how it was expressed initially, definitely waned. The more I did what I believe God was teaching me, and again, bro, pastorally, patiently, not shoving it down people's throats, but also being excited about. I think, bro, like the past 3 years, 2 years, because again, I was there 5 years. The first 2 years was just watching, little by little, making necessary changes. But the changes that I made were pragmatic at the time, those first 2 years. And then the last 3 years, probably 2 years, it was like, oh, these changes are intentional, because this is exactly what God prescribes.
Mhm.
This isn't me, like, as an innovative thinker, leader, coming up with something that I think would lead us to this heightened worship experience. This is something that God is commanding, right? Thinking about, like, the regulative principle. Up until my last Sunday, bro, I preached, and one of the ladies at the church said to me, in essence, I hope wherever you go next doesn't bring the type of division that was brought here. And she said, do you know what I mean? And I had an idea, but I wanted her to feel the tension. I said, no, I don't. What do you mean? She said, the regulative principle. I said, okay, are you saying that the regulative principle isn't biblical? And she says, well, it is and it isn't. And I said, okay, it can't be it is and it isn't. God doesn't speak with a double tongue. It either it is or it isn't. And if it's not, you need to show me why. And so she's combative with me. And I said, look, I'm not your elder anymore. I'm not your pastor anymore. You need to speak to the elders. And I think that, you think about this Josiah moment, bro, when God captures you in such a way where you are broken. Bro, I remember I used to hold Advent services at the church, bro. I used to
Mhm.
have people go up there and light candles. And like, of course you do that. Who doesn't do that? That I see Presbyterian pastors doing that. And then
Mhm.
when you are awakened, you take that red pill and you see, like, wait a minute, this isn't substantiated at all in scripture.
Yeah.
Like, what's the distinction between Protestants and Catholics who do a bunch of extra stuff, and we who do extra stuff, are we better with our extra stuff because we're Protestants and
Mm.
they're Catholics? Like extra stuff is extra stuff that doesn't glorify God.
Yeah.
So, bro, when I stopped doing those things, and I started doing the things that, which is crazy, and I'll just end here with this thought. I was doing a lot of things, right, that were extra, and when I started to do the things that God was showing in His Word to do, they were a lot less, but more powerful and brought forth more pushback than all the things I was doing before.
No, yeah, that's a really good thing to tease out a little bit. People will have no issues. Well, I shouldn't say no issues, but a lot of things get changed in church all the time.
Yes.
All the time. New pastor, same pastor. I mean, I heard about the stuff that was done here and the 6 years before I got here by the previous pastor, and there was all sorts of differences. But the second you say that I'm not just changing things because I want to, I don't know, grow the church or
Right.
improve the
Right.
church. When it comes to authority, people they there's something that clicks for them that then provokes this response of bothered. But it's interesting how change is fine in the church when it comes with no divine authority.
Mm, mm,
But
mm.
when change comes in the church with a divine authority, the people of God have an issue with it. It's absolutely backwards.
Yeah, man.
If anything, God's people should be uncomfortable with changes that obviously I'm not going to tell, oh, we changed the paint, you know,
Sure.
whatever. But all these little changes that are more substantial to like the life of the church, people should be bothered with why are we doing this? Is there any biblical reason for that? Should bother them.
Right.
But it's backwards. As long as men are the reason to do something, we're good.
Yeah.
When
And,
it's God, then we're not good. And there's a tension,
yeah,
I
and
think.
that's what's scary, bro. Is that, and that I think, man, this is what brought me to a really a deep conviction, bro, and almost like a sorrowful. You know, I look back and we recorded our services like other churches, and I look back at some of those practices, like the Advent, like the Christmas Eve service and Easter service, and all these like acknowledging of special days, outside of the Lord's Day. And I look back on these things, man, and the Lord was very patient with me. But bro, like I'm the pastor. I'm the pastor of this church, and that was very grieving to me looking back in light of what I learned. And the only way that I could make it right moving forward is not by continuing what I know to be wrong, but
Mhm.
by slowly, pastorally, and patiently implementing what God says is right and preaching to that end.
Yeah.
And
What
I,
kind of things did you start doing to implement? Like,
so for example, I started preaching through the book of First Timothy, and First Timothy ended up becoming the last series I preached through it. Took about a year to preach through Timothy, and there's a lot of things that took place, but there were two things that happened, bro. I'm preaching in Timothy, and around the same time, Zachary Garris, who wrote a book, Honor Thy Fathers, actually. And I started reading that book, and that book, coupled with reading through First Timothy, um, convicted me about something specific at our church, and this was a change that ended up taking place. Small change, but huge change. And that change was, it was this like this conversation about egalitarian, complementarian, and patriarchal. Okay, and seeing what the reformers said about male headship in the church, um, those who have an office and their responsibility, then that leads me to look into like what the confession of faith says, and starts going down that trajectory, asking questions. Well, at our church, we would have corporate prayer, okay? And in that corporate prayer, uh, we'd have anyone praying. It was kind of like everyone do everything that the minister is supposed to do because we're all equal across the board in everything. And so
Mhm.
there's no distinction in roles. And so women would pray publicly, and men, who shouldn't pray because it's the spiritual thing to do. Well, I took the public prayer out and I changed it for the pastoral prayer. And bro, I got levied all kinds of charges because of that practice. And again, I knew that these weren't changes I was wanting to implement because I think it's a good idea, but because this is the order that God has prescribed in the solemn assembly on the Lord's Day. And so, in talking with the elders about this, I started to see they're actually not all in agreement on this. And then it trickled into the conversation of feminism. And so I'm preaching through Timothy, and I'm preaching in such a way where it's in alignment with some of the practices that I've implemented. And now I lost it, bro. Now I'm silencing the voices of women at the church.
Mhm.
I only want men who are ordained, or men who have been set aside, or are going in the trajectory of ministry to do things that are particular to office bearers. And so it started to go downhill real quickly once I started implementing these things I was learning.
Yeah. One thing I've noticed when we're talking about further reformation, whatever it is, whether it's I want the Protestant Bible to preach out of, I don't think that we need a band to sing the Lord's songs. I do believe that we should preach an optimistic view, whatever it is. What I've noticed is that underneath the issue of these things being controversial, there is the issue of churches being led by the congregation.
Yes.
And I don't mean this in a polity sense, I mean this in a functional sense. I mean, many Presbyterian churches, the reason why things are done or not done in many ways, taught or not taught in many ways, is because the church feels that these things are what they should be led by. And with congregationalism also comes the female church member and the egalitarian element as well. The masculinity conversation is very much connected to the worship conversation, the holy days conversation. Like, one of the things I've noticed is churches are in some ways run by their members.
Yeah.
And when elders begin to govern the church and implement things as the governors of the church, they will go as far as the people who run the church, which are the members, will allow. And it's almost like, who are you? This is the thing like that we've dealt with it at times here at Pinelands. Like, who are you to tell the missions committee that they need to look for these kind of
Mm.
missionaries? Like who are you to just rip, you know, the pull the hymns out? We didn't do that. To be fair, like we didn't just all one day we didn't wake up a cappella, you know.
Mhm.
One day we didn't wake up EP. But when we started to, remove certain things and implement more psalms, it's like, who are you? And it's like the question is, no, actually, who are you?
Mhm.
Like, are respectfully, like, have you been anointed and called and gifted to the spiritual oversight of the Lord's flock? You haven't. And it's fine for these people to ask questions. It's fine for people to want shepherding, right? Can you shepherd me through this? Like, could you? But that's not what we're talking about.
No.
This is like, I don't want that done.
Mhm.
You better not do it.
Mhm.
And it's like, respectfully, like, I don't work for you, and I'm not like you don't wag me around, right? Like the tail wagging the dog. And it's like, wow, you're an unteachable man, you're a
Right.
harsh man. And it's like, try that logic with your boss.
Mhm.
Just try that. Let's see how long any of these people would be employed
Yeah.
if they took any of that tone with their bosses. And they say, well, that's different. How is it different? It's an authority. And the reality is the authority of Christ in his church has a lesser weight than the authority of the man who pays you.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it comes out in these conversations.
Yeah, and I think it's heightened in my circle that I was in because um, we have a Mennonite background, Brethren background, and so there's a distinction between kind of the earthly and the spiritual, and so the spiritual you can kind of just sloppily do things um, because it's you're being moved by the Spirit, as it were. So, for example, to kind of concrete what I'm saying is, it was voted that we would get Salters. I made the case for Salters, and so the church agreed that we could buy Salters. And I knew that singing Psalms would do more heavy lifting on my behalf than I could do. And, in other words, not only is this experiential preaching taking place, we're also singing God's songs. And in singing these songs, it would bring out things that I may or may not be able to cover in my sermon this week or in this series, right? And so what ended up happening is uh, some of the people that come from these backgrounds who are leading worship are singing these psalms, and these psalms are saying things that they would never say,
Mm-hmm.
right? At one time we sang an imprecatory psalm. I explained the psalm. I explained, the application of imprecatory psalms, um, and I did that, and then uh, we sang it. It was beautiful. It was glorious. Well, some people felt like they couldn't sing it because they were sinning, and then weeks later, come to find out, one of the people that were leading worship said, "I will never ever sing an imprecatory psalm." And just the attitude and the gall behind that, it showed me that that word, bro, that is sharper than any two-edged sword. When it cuts deep and it exposes. And that's what was happening in many ways at the church. It was through the preaching, it was through follow-up conversations, it was through the singing of psalms. And then one more thing, one of the groups, we had three separate groups leading worship. One of the groups was led by a young man who became convinced of exclusive psalmody. So when he led worship his week, it would be all psalms. And that happened for about a month with him leading worship. Every third week, it would be his week with his team to lead worship, where one of the elders eventually pulled him to the side and said, "Enough. We're not going to be doing only psalms when you sing worship. And if you can't, stop that, then you're not going to be able to lead worship anymore." And he said, "Fine, I'll step down." And he stepped down. And him and his wife eventually ended up leaving the church as well for reasons like that and others.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the thing, bro. That word, when it's sung, when it's preached, when it's prayed, when it's applied appropriately, it brings about, it exposes. And that's what happens, bro, in Reformation. And what you can do is either repent, right? And humble yourself and take the position of a child and say, "Man, I need to grow, I need to learn, I have questions," or you can buck up against it and fight, and now find yourself in a place of rebellion against it.
Yeah. And that's kind of leading into one of the other things I want to touch on. Like, what are the deeper heart issues? So we have reform and reforming, right? We're reforming and we're growing in what that means. We're introducing it, we're adding things. And yeah, out comes the tension and the accusations, whatever. And there's really a deeper there's deeper issues underneath. And you just touched on one. The reason why we are bothered about the singing of psalms is not actually because I feel very strong about the fact that God prescribes hymns, but much of that has to do with these words that I now sing with my lips and praise God for, they confront me.
Mm.
They confront me in ways that I do not want to be confronted. And they commend me to things that I don't want to commend myself to. And so the issue is not what songs do we sing. The issue is the heart's
Yeah.
obtuseness to words of God. Now, it's one thing to know that Psalms 2 was in the Bible, but it's another thing for you to sing to God in praise that psalm. That's
Hey,
very
can I?
different.
Yeah, and let me add to that, bro. With that point, it's one thing to think that the Psalms is a book in the Bible that I could frequently or infrequently visit. It's another thing to know that God doesn't want you to just visit the book in reading, but that He wants you to meditate on this by virtue of singing it, right? Like to frequent yourself with the Psalms enough that it would flow out of your heart, right, through your vocal cords to your lips, and then be examined by what you're singing, and then also because the psalmist is invoking judgments on God's enemies, right? Uh, so there's that aspect, but then there's this experiential aspect in which you're actually fellowshipping with Christ, who is the song leader, right?
Mhm.
And the one to whom we're singing with. So there's this experiential aspect where if I relegate it to just having to read it, right? I could say I did that, but in the singing of these psalms, you're not only saying something about me, but now there's a distinction between us that's distancing me from you. And the easiest way for me to detach myself from actually doing it is to say that you're a legalist, is to bring charges forth. So I think there's a lot. I know this isn't about psalm singing, but I think something like psalm singing, bro, is so powerful, man. uh when we do it, especially without instruments, that the devil hates, and that those who have never had to think through these things, it brings something out of them that it's easier to run away from than to run to and think about in a way that they've never thought about before.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's good. Other other things I think that would also be underneath. I think Reformed theology, it forces everybody to embrace their subjection to Christ, and that subjection would speak to the places that are particular to them. So I think passive men, effeminate men, men that are not doing well as men, this kind of stuff that we're talking about will direct men to be men. And a lot of the men that struggle the most with these God-centered, objective, not diluted or distracted with many excess things. Thinking like, I feel like when you worship Christ with all this noise and bands, it doesn't force you to deal with yourself, because as a kid can't really deal with what they are in themselves character wise. If they constantly have a device, they constantly have something that is entertaining them, it's hard for them to know who they really are. A man cannot know who he is until he has to just focus on the words of Christ without a bunch of harp strings and things being plucked. So a man will not know how much he should be God centered when he begins to worship in such a way, be governed in such a way that calls him to take responsibility. And so I think a lot of what happens when we begin to reform is that men become very aware of where they lack. And that could bring them to either see the need to grow as men or turn the guns on you and then say you are the unfair, unrighteous
Yep.
man, when it has nothing to do with that. The reality is you are a weak man who is now being made aware of your weaknesses through the oughtness of God being brought to more areas of life. And that's what the issue is, right? Or the issue is your wife controls your marriage, bro. Your wife runs your home. And now your wife is not happy with things going on in your church because she's not happy and she controls you and she runs you and you have a bad marriage. Now you have an issue with reformation, but the issue is not with reformation. The issue is you have a bad marriage, you have a bad dynamic, and she is leading you and guiding you. And now this whole conversation about reformation has nothing to do with the actual things,
That's
but
right.
it's about your bad marriage, you
Yep.
know?
Yeah, man. And bro, we could talk about that for hours for real. Because there's levels to that, right? Not only your marriage, but the way you were educated taught you to be like that, right? Like most people are educated in ways that would cause them not to think for themselves, not to question the person in authority in a way that would dig deeper than what they're initially told. And so when you get into this reformed world where people are saying things and teaching things that take you beyond what you're used to, now you're having to do something you've never done before. And now you're having to think in ways you've never thought before.
Yeah.
And you get to this breaking point where I said this to you, bro. Reformed theology made everything worse and everything better in my life. And I would never go back to not believing the things that I believe. And when I say everything worse, my situation. I'm not. I don't have a job right now. I'm looking for employment. I could have stayed at this church and conformed in a way that appeased men so that I would still have a job and still bring in income for my family and still say things that God's people would be encouraged by, but I would have been neutered before the Lord and not had conviction. And that isn't the type of husband my wife married, nor is the father my children know me to be, nor is the man I want to stand before the Lord one day with. So I want to be as a minister of the gospel who, though not ordained in the presbytery yet, by a presbytery yet, I want to be a man that stands before the Lord one day and said, Lord, I did the best I could do with the resources I had. And I even tried to go beyond the resources I had to grow in ways that I wouldn't have grown otherwise. So I think, man, like there's something about like um, becoming a man and walking in that in your life outside of the pulpit that blends with what that looks like in the church, in the pulpit through your preaching, that I've noticed that is lacking in many people. Like they're real tough when it comes to like saying things, with a high voice or, monotone voice. And then when you see other areas in their life where these forms of reformation haven't taken place, well, then they can't see reformation through, right?
Yeah.
Now, God can work beyond them, but if they can't see it
Yeah.
through in their homes right there, then they're not going to see it through when the
Yeah.
more challenging things come.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And again, it's not to say everybody that says this is the same.
Sure.
And if this is so, no one, a broken clock can be right twice a day. But what I've noticed is very often is the people that usually, and I say usually, the people that usually have the most carnal responses to growing in reformation are those that are severely lacking in basic areas of life. So you have these, I'm just repeating what you're saying because I always want to say it again. You have these strong convictions about biblical preaching and all these practices, right? But you don't have a demonstrable concern for virtue in your marriage and with your kids or just with people relationally. Like you don't model a passion for reformation in these other areas, and you are supposed to have this keen mind of reformation in other areas when your life demonstrates a neglect.
Mm.
So I was talking to I talked to many families, but I was like, if if your husband is not passionate, if he's not passionate about loving and leading you in the governance of the home, it's going to be very hard for him to speak clearly to what he believes governance in this church is lacking, because obedience is essential to discernment. And ignoring God in crucial areas of your life is going to hinder your ability to see his will in others areas of your life, you know? And so, yeah, come talk to me. Come talk to me about what it means to do the right thing and your whole family's apostate. You know what I'm saying? I'm
Right.
not I'm not saying that every kid has to be saved, you're raised in a Christian home, but I'm talking about some of the people in the church world that have the most to say about reformed ministers have an entire family of apostate kids.
Yeah.
And I think one of the issues that happens is that when autonomy when autonomy is usurped by theonomy. Now, I don't mean theonomistic or anything, but just the concept of theonomy, right? Uh, when what I want is usurped by what God wants, you become very aware of what is wrong with you and what you need. And so many people have a spirituality that does not make you feel very weak, very lacking. It's very lazy. It's like microwavable spirituality. So I want to process spiritual things in my laziness, in my lack of having a deep sense of need. And in comes these things that all of a sudden push us and they challenge us and they threaten us and they turn us upside down. And rather than embrace the ride, you seek to diminish, destroy, deplete, invalidate all these things so that you can keep being the lazy, indifferent, and inconsistent Christian. But you have a story. We have a story, right, that you've crafted that is very intricate to justify those things. And so when you begin to, I was saying this the other day, when you begin to add more steps to the journey, you hit more bumps. And when you make more turns and you hit more bumps, what's in those cups in the center console begin to shake and stuff starts coming out. And when the stuff starts coming out, like, you drove here,
Right.
and that's why all this stuff is coming out. No, the drive and the bumps showed us what was there the whole
That's
time.
right. That's right. Well, so I know you're thinking through this book of the Bible, the book of Deuteronomy. It's exactly what's happening, right? I mean, God uses Moses to deliver the children of Israel out of bondage, and one of the first things they have a problem with is, you're the one, Moses, who's bringing us into trouble, and we want to go back to where the leaks are, right? This is Exodus, but you want to take us back to, you want to take us to a place that's uncertain, where God is going to be with us, but but we want to go back to a place where God wasn't there, but things were comfortable. And I think people want to be comfortable in their understanding of things, and especially, and this is what I found where I was, is that, um, to your point, things were messed up a generation ago,
Mhm.
and they hired pastors to put a band-aid on it. And
Mhm.
every time a pastor there were two other pastors previous to me, prior to me, who were there 5 years each, right? So 5, 10, and I was the last one that was there for 5 years, 15 years with the three of us. Before us three, there was a pastor there that was there for 15 years. He was weak, he was passive, he did not deal with issues. And so, some of the family members that now 15 years later that I'm having to interact with, when they were children, there were these things that were undealt with for all these years that now are being dealt with. The leadership there didn't have the bandwidth, the structure, the foundation at all to ever deal with something confrontational, because they hadn't dealt with it 30 years ago.
Yep. And that's That's the most generational element of depravity, and that's something that I actually have brought up more than once. A lot of the issues that men are encountering, it's I'm doing something that just was overlooked and neglected for a very long time.
Mhm.
And for example, like I was talking about the worship stuff, and there was someone that was, talking about their issue with the worship stuff. I said there has not been a session that I know of here that taught on worship.
Mm, mhm, mhm.
Y'all
Yeah,
didn't teach on worship. You didn't care about worship, but now you care about worship that I'm teaching on worship.
right, right.
This is the irony.
Yeah,
Um, there are things that you have never cared enough to actually go in, and then when someone does your job that you didn't do, you don't thank them and say, you know what, I'm glad that you're doing something that we should have done. You're all of a sudden now very passionate about doing something that you didn't do when someone else is doing it. And again, like I don't buy it. I don't buy it. You're reacting for your presuppositional issues, but you clearly did not have a concern. So, for example, many things we do in church, actually, no one's ever taught on them.
mhm,
There was never a time where someone said, we're going to now teach on why we have testimony time or why we have giving. And like, we've never taught on these things,
mhm.
but they're just done.
Right.
And then when this is what we said earlier, then when someone teaches on things they're doing, it's like you're being a tyrant. So let me get this straight. Someone says, I am doing this only because someone above me has said we can do it. And all we've been doing in so many ways has nothing to do with a higher authority.
Right.
Who is a tyrant? Who is a tyrant? And here's the thing
Come on, man.
that pastors have to realize, like God says, look, to Samuel, they're not rejecting you, they're
Right.
rejecting me.
Right.
So this is
Right.
the issue. Like this is why you have to be very pious in a good way before the Lord, because you will receive all of the issues that God's people have with the Lord. You see that with Moses, you see that with Samuel, you see that with Elijah. People will take out their issues with God with the person that is seeking to defer to him, right? And you get accused of all sorts of things, and rather than converse, it goes to accusation and slander and whatnot, because that's more emotionally effective, right?
Right.
It's, if you say, for example, if you were to say, I believe this pastor who holds to head coverings, or he holds to the TR position, or he holds to the establishment principle, or he holds to you know the patriarchal position, whatever.
Mhm.
I believe that he's incorrect, and I believe that the Bible teaches this. You say that, no one's going to be mad at that guy,
Yeah.
and no one's going to flee the church in a rage. But if you say, for example, like like someone told me like that, my told was telling people that my view of the establishment principle means that I am promoting a Christianity that advances the gospel by violence.
Mhm.
And so you say that to people,
Mhm.
and they're like, "Oh yeah, this is crazy guy. This is a sinful guy." But if you say, "Well, this man teaches the establishment principle because it's a confessional view and it sees these texts as a reason for holding that view, it's wrong. Here's why." That will not create that reaction.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I noticed, that Reformation will expose weak men for who they are.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can't you can't persuade people. You can't reason from the scriptures. You got nothing, bro.
Yeah.
And reformed theology is from the scriptures, bro.
Mhm.
It's from the text. And if you got nothing, you know what you're gonna do? You're gonna whine, cry, insult, exaggerate,
Mhm.
gaslight folks,
Yep.
because you have nothing.
Yep.
You have nothing. You know, so it's like Stephen's reasoning from the scriptures. And after all that, it's like, this guy preaches against the temple. He tells,
Right.
like you have nothing to say.
Right.
You got nothing to say. And a lot of the anger is not like with men in this world that we're in. It's not like you're being unbiblical. It's like we can't resist the reason which you're coming to us with. We can't
Right.
argue against it. And we're prideful about it. And people are listening to you and they're not listening to me. And I don't like that. So I'm
Right.
going to, get a bunch of people to throw rocks at your face that are willing to listen to nonsense, hearsay, insinuation, and speculation, not people that will listen to exegesis and sound reason, right?
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so,
And yeah, man. And that's what's discouraging. You think of like, because again, these aren't faceless people, right? These are people that you pray for, that you will drop everything in light of an emergency, hospital visits, and cry for their soul. I had gotten people sending me all these types of critical things, and I'd asked them, at one time, have I benefited your family in any way? And the response was crickets, silence. I mean, and this individual that I'm speaking of, his spouse was going through a life crisis, talking about um, suicide and all these things. And then I remember, just without question, bro, because that's what God called me to be, as their shepherd, to be there and to love them and to give them resources and to pray with them and to do all these things. And when things had gotten to the point where I had lost my usefulness in their eyes because I wasn't saying the things that they want to hear in the way they want to hear it, then I became an enemy. And now they could see nothing good of all that I've done on their behalf. And that's really just the cost of ministry, right? Overall, is that the people you desire to see conformed into the image of Christ, right? Some people say that the sheep bite,
yeah.
and that's the unfortunate aspect of ministry,
Yeah. And idolatry makes you irrational,
right?
So, if someone who is, and I'm thinking about, it's a good thing you brought the face's name, because all this stuff is not like ethereal abstract. I mean,
Right.
this is like real stuff, real
Yeah, man.
people.
Yeah.
I know people, like, I walk with them through all sorts of things, married them, shepherded them, opened my lives to them. And now, because I sing psalms without instruments, you want nothing to do with me at all, and you don't even want to be around me as a leader. And I'm like, wow, man, like, that's idolatry, bro. You love noise more than people, bro. You love certain kinds of songs more than you love people. You know what I'm saying? That's what it comes down to. It's like, it's one thing, like, I've heard you, like, I don't understand these practices as well as you do. I'm not sure I'm there, but I see the grace of God in the church. I see healthy leadership and character. I see integrity. So I'm not singing music I would prefer. I like noise. You think it's not good. All right, I'm good. But, like, for someone to write you off uh as a man entirely over certain things like that, I mean, it says something about the lack of gospel affection that people have in the church, and certain things bring it up, because it's kind of funny, because a lot of times what happens with reformers who are reforming is the humility card comes out, like the affectional card comes out, and
Jesus.
the mercy card comes out, and some of these people are the most unmerciful, ungracious, intolerable people in the church.
Legalistic, right?
Yeah, and it is somewhat of an ironic tragedy. I'm sitting over here and I'm listening to you accuse me of things, and I'm walking you through it. I'm helping you think through it. Like, you're sitting over here telling me, you're, because of experimental preaching and preaching more things in light of the gospel, I'm not preaching the gospel. This is what I've heard people say to me, like, you don't preach the gospel anymore. And so I begin to help them think about that. I don't attack them. You know, I begin to help them think about that, and let me show you why you're wrong. And you know, you're very fair as you're reforming, and people struggle with it. And these people that are very concerned for God's graciousness, they just lack an aura of grace. You know, like and so again, you realize that idolatry is very powerful. It's very real in church. It makes you irrational and it makes you inconsistent. And these are, and we're not saying these things, whoever's listening, because here's our pity party. It's not about that, but we want to help you how to process these things. Because let me tell you something. This is hard stuff. This is very hard stuff. This is very painful stuff, and you need the tools to process it.
Yeah.
You need the tools to navigate it, and you need the discernment, discernment. But go ahead, say something before I ask something.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think this conversation is helpful for people because, bro, you know how it is. You know, you there's people who are digging into these things and they're on an island. Maybe they're Baptist, right? And they're looking into Presbyterian, you know, and all that, and now they can't talk about it, so they feel like they're on an island. So these kind of conversations are like, I'm not crazy, right? I'm not crazy. And so I think it's helpful on that end. But then I think the other side of the coin that is also helpful with is, bro, like the fortitude that it takes as a man to keep moving forward, taking the blows and persevering when, like, as Athanasius said, right? The world is against you. And he says, no, I'm against, you know, me and God are against the world in essence, right? Like God, like Paul said, if God be for me, who can be against me? Like that's the kind of men that God uses, weak men, right? Not perfect, blameless by God's grace, but men who want to see God glorified, then men feared, right? We want to fear God more than we fear men. And I think that kind of work, the work of reformation and revival that takes place externally must first take place internally. And then internally and then locally where you're at, and then it trickles, bro. And where it goes, bro, only the Spirit knows, right? You know, God can raise up a man like a Luther or a Calvin or a Zwingli or a Knox and do things beyond they anticipated initially. But it starts there, bro. Fearing God, looking to his word, obeying it, and walking that out by way of implication where God has placed you. And, bro, it's the Spirit's work of reformation and revival that he is going to accomplish. And there's means to that end, which is what we're talking about.
Yeah, amen. How about this to think about as well? Because we talked a lot about what we've seen with others and around us. What did God show you that was wrong with you as you were seeking to reform his church? Where were you exposed, and what did you learn about yourself?
Yeah, so thank you for asking that. It kind of lends itself to what I just said, is that I feared man. You know, I feared, you know, what are the people going to think? Am I gonna lose my job? Um, am I going to be? And it's funny, man. All the things that I feared ended up happening, but when my perspective changed and I recognized this is sinful, I shouldn't fear man. God is sovereign, right? I'm a Calvinist. I believe God is sovereign over all things. He can provide a job for me that will sustain my family. I'm not a bought man, you know.
Mm.
And so when you kind of shake yourself up and you wake up and you say, man, like the, God hasn't changed. I've changed. And so I think when that happened to me, bro, initially, bro, again, just for the sake of context, the pastor that was there left 2020. 2020 was crazy in and of itself. I
Yeah.
was working a full-time job, right? Now I had pastoral experience, but I was working a full-time job. And when I was brought on as kind of like just fill the pulpit until we find someone. So here I am working a full-time job, also functioning in the pastoral, you know, work here at the church while going through a pandemic, right? All that. And so initially my work was to maintain the church. to take that stupid sign off the door that said, 6 feet distance or put your mask on. Like that was being a hero then, bro. And
Yeah.
like I was being put on shoulders, by people like, oh, he's so brave, for such a time as this. But then when that brave reformational work morphed into now things normalizing in
Hmm.
the church, and now it's shifting to like doctrinal issues, I wasn't brave anymore. I'm the one who divided the church. So I think the Lord really showed me my fear of man, and really kind of, as it were, punched me in the mouth, man, and said, look, like, are you going to be like Jeremiah? Are you? And this is crazy too. And I'll close with this. I would read about these men that God used mightily to bring forth reformation and revival. And I admired them on my bookshelves, right? But they're like me, men with the word of God and the spirit of God who's called to preach the word of God. But I wasn't acting like them. I was being a coward. Well,
Hmm.
what is this elder going to say? Or what are they going to think if I do this? Or if it's like, what does God think?
Hmm.
Like, what does God think about what this passage teaches in Colossians? So what if they don't think that it teaches this? And so I think, man, when I came to that point, bro, and that happened gradually, man. But when I came to that point, it was no turning back. And again, I wasn't like a bull in a china shop. I wasn't ungracious. Sure, I could have done things better. I've shared that with you, man. There's things that I regret, but there weren't sins that I committed. It's like I needed an older man to say, son, I love your zeal and your passion and all this, but come here. These are some things like that we could do in a way that will help us in the long run,
Hmm.
as opposed to just rushing into it. And I wasn't rushing into so I think that was lacking. But to answer your question, bro, it was the fear of man, bro. It was the
Hmm.
fear of man.
Yeah, yeah. For me, I would say that it's a few things. Number one, like, I think that there's a way to be overwhelming in truthfulness, and I think that's something that I have seen in the past is I can not only be truthful, but I could be overwhelmingly truthful. And that sounds mysterious. And what does it mean to be overwhelmingly truthful? It means to uh, speak with a forcefulness that is not accompanied with other things that then give a more complete picture of the the Reformation and the man. So there's that there's one thing. Um, but the other is, man, like, I think my weakness, uh, my lack of, I think, healthy overall living before the Lord in every sense of the term, of the term, meaning like spiritually, devotionally, just life skills, like, boundaries, sleeping. Like, when I was doing this hard work of reformation, my life in the home was very burnt out, and I had this zeal for reformation in the church. It was hard, it was heavy, it was weighty. And because I was not living a disciplined, watchful life overall, it depleted me in the home. And so I was just gassed. I was gassed, uh, emotionally and physically. And so at home, I would be less attentive, less engaged, less involved, more short, more temperamental. And so if I would say one thing that I was exposed to is that I am not strong enough comprehensively to be strong over here reformationally. So if I'm going to be strong reformationally, then there's a whole lot more comprehensive strengthening and discipline and mindfulness that needs to happen. And so my life changed through reforming and then seeing how many places of my life lacked comprehensive stability and fortitude. And that'll come out in certain areas. But
Yeah,
um,
and what's encouraging about that, bro, is like the spirit is not dependent on us. Right, like the Lord uses means, like he uses people. So you could look and see like all the discrepancies in Luther's life and go, dang, you know. But that's the man God chose to use in the time that he used them, right? You can look at all the men throughout history. That isn't an excuse for lapses and all these things. But what I'm saying is the spirit accomplishes great things through weak men and broken men, and
Mhm.
it is all to highlight the bigness, or the grandeur of God, right? And the power of God, and he takes that little that we have, even though it's much in comparison to others. He takes that little and he multiplies it in ways, bro, that we could never ever fathom, bro.
Yeah.
And big picture, right? Like, God makes, we know this, like, God makes promises that will transcend, like the work that you're seeing take place in pylons and in your own heart and in your home and all these things on a micro level. God's going to do this in all the earth, bro. Right? So like, these are promises that we have from God's word that we can't see, but these are things that he's doing in pockets of places that will collectively come together, and it will all magnify him in spite of our weaknesses. And that's
Yeah.
encouraging, bro.
Yeah. And one thing I would say too, to encourage you guys here is that are listening, and even just ladies that maybe, I don't know, I don't get I don't get a lot of emails from ladies every once in a while, but I'm assuming there's some ladies that listen to the podcast, is that just because people take elements of your character that truly are flawed, and just because the work of reformation that you're doing could be done better and there is places where you drop the ball, it doesn't mean that them writing you off comprehensively because there's some believable things where you truly err. Don't listen to that, bro.
Right.
That is a
Man.
very strategic weapon of the devil that he manipulates Christians to be a part of.
Yep.
They will take things. Half these people don't know what they're doing. That's why there's letters where he says the devil's wiles and his ways in the church. He works through Christians. He works through Peter. Right? Get behind me, Satan. They will take things about you that are true but not representative of you, and they will make it to be the entire narrative to invalidate everything you're doing. You have to learn the art of ignoring such things while being open to receive the truthfulness of the sliver of truth that they are exaggerating.
Yes.
That sliver of truth or that blunder or that you got to be able to hear that, even though that they are running wild with it, right? Because at the end of the day, it may not be true about me comprehensively, but if it's true in some sense, then I can grow in that area, even though people they're not telling me these things to grow you. They're telling you because they want to destroy you to vindicate themselves. This
And
is
bro,
this.
that's the heart, bro. Right there, what you just said, bro. That's heart work. That's hard, bro. That's that going before the Lord and seeking him, and I'm not talking about some, woo woo way, but just like, Lord, search my heart. You know me, you see me, and really having these conversations with the Lord and with yourself, like, man, like, because you see discrepancies in yourself. You know you, right? God knows you. And so when people, this is to your point, bro, people will say things and the devil will use them to say things, not just anything, right? Like, if somebody levied a charge against you that wasn't particular to your strengths and weaknesses, then it wouldn't really hit. But if it was for me, then it's like penetrating and it hurts because there's a sentiment in which, dang, like, I think those things or have thought those things about me or have heard those things from others about me. And I
Mhm.
need to decipher through what's what and what's not. And that's hard, bro.
Yeah, yeah. And another thing too is many people like that will seek to kill the reformer. Many of them are the ones that actually don't take the time to know them and hear them out. What they do is they speak very strongly from a distance, And the people that have actually like known you the most and they've given you opportunity to talk the most, they're like, I know all those things that are being said about you are not true because I know you.
Right.
But many people will intentionally keep a distance because if they actually were to move towards you, they would know that you're not the demon that they're pushing in the narrative.
It would mess everything up.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there's oftentimes a strategic distancing of the most vocal people for the purposes of not allowing what many others know to be true, namely like your God-given graces, right? And so this is one of the things like I don't know if I'll do it, but eventually like the art of Reformation, like I feel like I need to like write out like a Sun Tzu art of warfare when you it's not just the act of reforming, but the mentality and mindset and the wisdom of reformation that I think is it's a huge thing because many men and I would include myself like we know what we're supposed to do, but when all the stuff comes around what we're doing and then how to navigate the all around what we're doing that we know to be doing, like how do you process these things and how do you navigate these things and how do you think through these things and how do you time these things, like that can be much more challenging, the art of reforming. And I think one of the reasons why many churches don't do very well in growing a church that is very reformed to be more than like a look, I'm not saying that every 50 person every 30 to 50 person church is the same. I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is if every major reformed church is less than 50 people, there probably could be something about the art of reforming, the way of reforming, the principles around reforming that you lack competency in. And you know how to do the right things, but the way to do the right things and flush them out and to navigate warfare and challenge and all this stuff, it can be lacking where you've only figured out how to do it with a very narrow kind of person. Because when more people start coming into like this church context that are not this, I understand everything we do. I don't understand half what we do, or I don't understand anything that we do. When those people start coming in, a lot of this stuff happens right now. Even in the most reformed church, where most people have like minded, there still could be the issues, but it becomes more perplexing and challenging. And so you have to be very good at not just doing reform things, but showing people and carrying yourself in those things in a way that is smart, wise, strategic, persevering, and calculated, right? And so here's like where I would maybe like, yeah, I would try to land the plane and conclude. Uh, what would you do differently if you could go back in time? What would you do differently and why?
Yeah, so I've thought about this a lot. What
And,
I would
well, that question and the next question before I forget, why? What helped you? What helped you to consider? You were back and forth between should I leave or should I stay? Should I wait? Should I tarry? Like what? Because I want to hear you say this because there's a lot of guys in in the reform world like, do I stay or do I leave? And I think you talking that would be helpful. So what would you do something different? And also, what was that helped you process the stay or leaving thing?
yeah, what I would do more different is um not a lot, but what I would do is important is I would speak more clearly about where I was and that's say not a lot because I was clear, but I was in an environment in which what I believed initially was hidden. For example, when I was taken on at the church, they never mentioned to the congregation that I held to the positions I held to. So the congregation never knew what I believed because it was never communicated to the church at any point.
Hmm.
And so there was always this like, I don't have anything to hide, but I guess I do, you know. And so that kind of bled into the fear of man. And so I think behind the scenes, I would have been more upfront with the leadership and said, look, um, this isn't a suggestion. These aren't just my convictions, because it became like a joke almost with the elders, like, oh, he's a post millennial, he's Presbyterian, and it was almost like, haha, like, but it wasn't like, no, like there's real distinctions here, and this isn't. We can't just like, as leaders, just be kumbaya because we believe the same thing about justification by faith alone. That doesn't mean we're not united in Christ and all those things. But as far as leading here at the church as the pastor, and us not being on the same page as elders, um, holistically, at least for the vision of, moving forward with where we stand at, that's problematic. And so I would have really pushed that a bit more, and not as an ultimatum, like you better believe this or I'm out, but this is where I'm at, and this is really where I'm at,
Hmm.
and this is really the direction I'm going to this end. Instead of doing that, um, thinking that I could win. For example, man, I bought the elders a book on covenant theology so that they could see in reading this book that covenant theology is biblical.
Hmm.
Instead of saying, look, no, here's the book, but this is not only what I believe, but this is what I'm going to be preaching and teaching from now on. And if there's a problem with that, you should let me know now so that we know where we're going moving forward. So
Hmm.
I was trying to be overly strategic, and not as direct as I could have been. And therefore, I wasn't there wasn't any friction for a long time until there was friction, which brings me to the second point. Um, what I would have done. So that was what I would have done different. And what was the second part of your question?
Why did you ultimately leave instead of
Okay.
stay and hope for reform?
Yes. So why I eventually left was I needed to make a decision for my own sake, for the sake of the people, and for my family, that I cannot keep going back and forth, uh, emotionally and, in my mind. I was so conflicted by these things, bro. Like there was weeks where I was like, "All right, I'm done," and then I would have a talk with someone and say, "Okay, I'm not done." Oh, there's this glimmer of hope. Okay, I'm not done. I'm not, and I've done that. I did that for a little over a year, and I'm not saying there isn't anything to that. You don't just get up and leave when there's conflict. But if you have exhausted all your resources to an end, and it isn't reciprocated, and it's almost the antithesis of that, then you got to see the writing on the wall at some point. And that's exactly the point I came to. Is like, I'm gonna die doing this, and no one's gonna be here to pick up the pieces. My
Hmm.
wife will be, right. Um, and the kids will have the fragments of me, and for what? Like, I'm doing, and bro, it ended up being that again, I had the people in mind. I've got individuals in mind at the church, right? Like, I love these people. I can't just get up and leave. What's going to happen if that happens? Now I went about it the right way. I gave my resignation. I was there for 7 weeks after giving the resignation, after making it public, because that was, what their documents said. So I honored that, and that was the hardest thing I'd ever done, bro. Is to see people, to hear things, and to hear slander and gossip, and then to see people leave the church, so that the church was relatively empty by the time I left. And all of it being the narrative that I'm the one who did something wrong. Well, that's what I feared initially, and that's why I held back. But it got to the point, bro, in short, where I was going to die, bro, have a stroke, have, something happen to me. And I just got to the point, was like, Lord, I, I don't think you are calling me to this end anymore. And I'm just going to pursue that end by faith and see where this goes. Now, you had made a point, bro. You said to me one time, you said, because I thought, okay, I'm seriously, I'm saying this, right? I'm making this resignation, and I mean it, this is the date. That's it. It's in paper, right? With in the back of my mind thinking, oh, here it goes. Like people are gonna ask questions, and now there's gonna be reformation. The elders that shouldn't be elders are gonna step down, and now the church is gonna ask me to like lead them through reformation and going through. And bro, none of that happened. And you told me, and I talked to my wife about this. She was like, "Wow." She said, "If the people of God um, cannot receive the ordinary means of grace that God has ordained for the people of God to be changed by through the preaching of the word, through the sacraments. If they can't be changed by that toward reformation, they're not going to be changed by you making an announcement that you're leaving the church. That was the essence of which it, because me making that announcement isn't a means to transform God's people, whereas the gospel and the word of God that I've been preaching for 5 years, and it's particularly the past 3 years where I'm honing in on these things that we've been talking about, that hadn't changed them, it hardened them. So
Mhm.
that was an indication that my time had come to an end there and I
Mhm.
needed to move on. And that's ultimately why.
Yeah, that's good. That's helpful. And I think one thing to put out there is not every pastor is supposed to help a church in the sense of softening their hearts and growing them. There is in the Bible and beyond the Bible a ministry of judgment. Like some men are called to places to close churches, to, give them over to a less than robust Christianity. Like you see that in the prophets. Like, okay, you want these people that are going to give you superficiality, then I'm going to give you over to a superficial ministry. And and everyone thinks that because the church is declining through actual pursuit of reformation, that there must be something. No, that God does judge the visible church. He does give churches over either to a less than comprehensively transforming, growing ministry, or he will close them entirely visibly. But I think some of the things that you said that would be helpful to repeat and maybe add is that you should never be reforming at the expense of your walk before the Lord and your life. Now, I have to qualify that because I do think that ministry does come at an expense,
Absolutely.
right? I mean, sometimes we die and sometimes like we lose sleep and we lose friends. So, but there's a difference between thriving in afflictions, right? And you dwindling down and being gnawed uh, to the bone. And it's I'm not doing well as I am suffering and lacking. Actually, this is detrimental. And honestly, like I've had to ask that question many times. Like, are we thriving through afflictions, or are we in a place where the afflictions are actually uh, not advancing us to greater fruitfulness, but actually like they're just making us more stagnant and more bitter and
Right.
calloused, and so it's that's one thing that's important. But the other thing is the buy-in of those who lead with you, the buy-in of members. I think if you have growing buy-in, that's a good sign. I say growing buy-in because some people think unless you can keep 97% of the church on board with what you're doing, you shouldn't do anything
Right.
that would lose 3%. I think if you have growing buy-in, right? Like as we continue to teach and reform, I can see this reformation become a part of the church collectively. I think you can see that as a good thing to pursue, right? But if you're about these things and like it's just it seems to have like this smaller circle. Now, you have to be careful because sometimes you may, oh, well, this guy is getting it and this guy is getting it and this guy is getting it, but that's why I say growing
Mhm.
buy-in, particularly at the officer level. And I think another thing too is it's one thing to take a church from this to this, right? So let's say like this church is like they've walked from being Baptistic to Reformed Baptistic, right? Or Reformed Baptistic to being like PCA, right? But I think in your case, and this is just generally speaking, right? Generally speaking, because I've seen some people like they go from like being Southern Baptist and all of a sudden that church is like, well, it's like they're like super reformed. But I think generally speaking, a generation is not going to jump 3 steps.
Right.
It'll be 1 step, right? So our church is our church is we've jumped 1 step. We were PCUS, now we're PCA. Um, and so now, like in a span of 80 years, which is you're looking at 2 generations
Yeah.
now, we could potentially make another step. But for someone to go from Southern Baptist to like FCC like Reformed, which
Mhm.
is how you are, like it's just it could happen. But again, like you got to be careful. Like there's not going to be 3 or 4 steps that you make in 1 generation,
Right.
and you kind of got to see, where that church is at. And so I was reading with my kids today the end of Chronicles, and I said, notice David did all these things, but he could not finish. Solomon was called to do the rest,
Mhm.
right? And he went this far, and then someone else went further. And I think like there is a legitimate pace of an organic entity known as a church that no matter how good you're doing, they're not going to bypass, massive. It won't be organic, right? It won't be cemented, right? So
Especially when it's only you.
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Especially when it's only you.
yeah. Unless certain things happen, like a church split,
Sure.
right? Or some like it gets whittled down to the bone and it's like revitalized, right? And there's a lot of factors too. Like, I mean, for us, like our situation was a bit different because I planted a church. I planted a church that started from the ground up. And when I came to Pinelands, I had about 50 or so folks that had been a part of like a ground up. So like we're learning together, right?
Mm.
Like, what are we doing? I don't know. Okay, let's figure it out.
Right.
And then I come to a church where there's like, 100 or so uh, members that have been in place. And I say 100, maybe 120, I don't know. I think about 70 or 80 of those people are gone,
Mhm.
right? So you come into a situation, a new generation comes in of a significant amount, an older generation just disappears, and then new people come in, and all of a sudden, like
Ship.
there's a pliability,
Yep.
a malleability, that wouldn't be so if I just showed up at Pinelands
Mhm.
by myself and everybody mostly stayed. So like those things also, you don't plan for that, but you keep that anyway. So again, the art of reformation,
Yeah.
like how do you how do you go from A to C or A to B and C to E, um, and what are some factors that help? But I was trying to tell Edwin too is that like I guess let me not say just what I said. Let me close by saying this. What do you think? Do you think all this was worth it? And would you do it again?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do. Of course. Yeah. I mean, God's word is worth it. The Lord is worth it. So yeah, man. And again, like that doesn't mean, you know, the people that were hurt, um, there's a narrative that people are convinced about concerning me that no matter what I do moving forward, that will be etched in their minds forever.
Hmm.
It's not true. I wish that weren't the case, you know. But if someone said, if you could go back to how everything was prior to believing all these things, would you do it? No, no, because there's, and that's Paul said, bro, that I may know him in the fellowship of his suffering, being conformed to his death. Like, there's a fellowship in knowing the Lord in ways that he's revealed himself that also brings forth suffering that is unique, that you couldn't learn any other way. So do I want to be a part of something like this again? No, um, because I love God's people, even when they are not acting like God's people. But through this event, the Lord used it to grow me, to humble me, and to teach me, to cause me to be reflective, and to help me to keep growing and keep learning. It hasn't turned me away from the Lord. It hasn't turned me away from my giftings, my calling, first in my home and etc. So yeah, man, no, I think the Lord has used this and is going to use this to make me a better Christian and a better minister of the gospel. So I don't regret it.
Yeah. And you better like tattoo that on your forehead, mentally speaking, because uh Satan will haunt you for the rest of your life over this. He'll he'll haunt you, and then he'll bring people
Yep.
that will, oh yeah, yeah, you're doing this, but I know what you did. Like, so
Right.
that's the thing. Like, when, bro, when there is damage behind you, you have to learn how to move forward, because like those that scrap metal behind you, like Satan will very cunningly get those pieces and know how to keep throwing them in your face as if they're still in front of you,
Mhm.
um and you could, and then all of a sudden, when you're seeing something in front of you, that, like, when you encounter that pressure again, and you get in that environment, like, it's like, oh man, all of a sudden, like, you have like the past in front of you, and like, man, like, there's like a, I'm done, I finished, I learned, I grew, that's it, you know um I'm not carrying that with me in some definitive kind of sense, right? At the end of the day, like, people say, like, oh, I remember when you did this and you taught like this way, and like, and I remember, like, and I'm like, that's not who I am anymore, even if that was so. You know what I'm saying? Like, the glory to glory, right? Death and resurrection, and that maturing, like, literally, like, when you look at your kids, like, oh my goodness, my kids are not 3 feet tall anymore. They have different features. That's what happens. Like the Lord grows you, and you're a different person. And whatever is true about that in a over exaggerated sense, or whatever is partially true about that in a minimal sense, like, as you move on and you grow and you're sanctified, like, you can really say, like, yeah, that's not me anymore. So, for example, like, they're like, oh, I remember, like, when like, you used to say it like this, and I'm like, yeah, and I don't do it anymore.
Mhm. Mhm.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
but no, but you did it. You did it, and yeah. So what?
Mhm.
Like, and what? Uh, like, the Lord really does, in a sense, make us be something other than what we were like a year ago, a few years ago, Lord willing. But the sad thing is many folks, y'all just the same tired, stunted Christians for like year after year after year after year after year after year. You people look at your life the last 10 years, and you've gone nowhere, doctrinally, experientially. And it's not because of God's sovereignty, it's because of your stubbornness
Right.
and resistance to faithful men trying to help you grow. And God will give you over to this stunted, stagnant Christianity. But that's the thing I tell our people when I'm preaching. Listen, do you think you can shut down the Lord when he's speaking to you about something? Do you think you can reform later? You think you can embrace this later? God can shut a door that you never open ever in your life. Why do you think so many Christians die with so many views that have nothing to do with the Bible? Like, don't ever think that you can obtusely be pugnaciously against the promptings of the Spirit, and there'll be a time in your life where you're now in your 60s as a Christian, and you literally cannot understand these things. It's gone over. You know why? The calluses have been fermented.
Yep.
Hey, you're saved. God's gracious. But at the end of the day, like, bro, this is why I tell people, like, why do you want to be less than a God enjoying following? Why? What? I mean, to me, it's like, what's the point, bro? Like I want to. I want to be healthy enough not to die young. Like, I want to be as healthy as I can be, right?
Right. And those same people will say, they'll agree with you when you talk about the doctrine of sanctification and being conformed into the image of Christ, right? I want to be like him. And we sing hymns about these things. And it's like, all right, then this is what it looks like to be conformed into the image of Christ. You don't think Christ believed these things? Yeah, he did, you know? And so if you want to be like Christ, then keep walking with him.
Yeah. You want to be like Christ, let him be hacking up your branches over and over again that are dead. You know, anyways, really good conversation. I think this will be very helpful for quite a few folks. Hopefully it gets the attention of it's interesting how, like, the headline can be the difference between 1,000 clicks, and it's like, so hopefully this gets your attention, KP folks. I think this is one of the more practical, relational, pastoral ones. I mean, it's kind of like the Tertullian one was also similar to that, like piety, on the ground piety, processing things. So good stuff. Appreciate your time.
Absolutely, bro.
Show this man some love, man. How do people show you some love if they want to reach out to you?
One, pray for me, man. Pray for me and my family. We're going through a time of just self-reflection, seeking the Lord, next steps. So just pray for me and my family. Also, tangibly, if you want to go visit my podcast, that's The Proverbial Life on YouTube, you can do that. Just listen to some things and, leave a like, give a drop, say hi. I'm from, Kingdom Polemics. And yeah, man, that's it. Prayer. And if you want to hear more of what you heard, you can go over there and subscribe and go on from there.
Sounds good. All right. Grace and peace.
Grace and peace.
Signing off. Don't give up. Your labor is not in vain. I said to all you folks who know exactly what I'm talking about. All right. Till the next time, grace and peace, Kingdom Polemics signing off.
The price